let's have a nice cup of TRE in the afternoon with Hanna Murray.
Good afternoon. Joining us on the line now is Lily Dunn. She's a memoirist, teacher and mentor. Her literary memoir, Sins of My Father, was named Best Non-Fiction Book of the Year by The Guardian and The Spectator. Her new book, Into Being, The Radical Craft of Memoir and Its Power to Transform, is an essential guide to writing a memoir in a radical and empowering way. Welcome to the show, Lily.
Thank you so much, Hanna.
Oh, it's great to have you with us. So tell us a little bit about your memoir and what drew you to write it.
Well, my memoir that I wrote, Sins of My Father, which was about my father, as it says in the title. And I wrote it over a series of years, really. It kind of came out of a necessity to get certain experiences down on the page. He was quite a complex character. He left a family home when I was 6 and joined a religious cult. He was always sort of driven by his impulses, I suppose. I mean, that was back in the 70s. And then he lived in various countries around the world, and he was quite a successful businessman. But then he squandered it all in his last sort of 10 years. He lived in California and died of alcoholism. And but before that, he had lost his home, his wife, his business. And I was sort of left with this question of how someone who had lived, a very sort of charmed life and had a lot, given to him and was very talented and charismatic, had sort of lost it all, squandered it all quite so dramatically and catastrophically. And I think that really led me to the page. So writing for me has always been a form of kind of working out the world and asking questions of myself, and then sort of working it out on the page. And this book, Into Being, really is an extension of that, because it's looking at the craft of memoir and how it can transform your relationship to experience that you have in your life. So through the writing and crafting of that experience, you tend to sort of transcend it in some way.
Yeah. A lot of people talk about it as being pretty much a form of therapy, really therapeutic to write down things that you've been through.
Yes, and I really agree with that. And actually, I was really drawn to, because I this book and Sins of My Father came out of a PhD. I was studying for a doctorate, and I was really drawn to trying to bridge the gap between what we perceive as writing for well-being, therapeutic writing, and writing for publication, because I think there's still quite a lot of snobbery, in the kind of writing for publication realm. Even if it is memoir, you still have this sort of emphasis on it being, rightfully it being outward facing, thinking about your readership, so less about self-expression. But of course, from my own experience and talking to other memoirists, people who write personal narrative, actually there is a bridge between that, even crafting and researching, sort of looking at your experience through a different prism and through different people's experience, your immediate family and friends, through interviews and things, can actually really help you therapeutically as well. So even if you're writing something very beautiful and very crafted, it can also be really helpful to you.
Yeah, I think it would kind of take the pressure off if you're not writing with the view of this needs to be published, who's going to read this, how much money is it going to make. If you're just focusing on the writing and getting it out of your system, if you like, onto the page, and then you can go back and edit it if you decide that you want to try and get it published, and you can, go back and go over it multiple times. But just that initial getting the words on the page, you don't really want to think about that, I suppose.
Well, I think so. And that's very much the kind of, the understanding of writing for well-being, is that you shouldn't be thinking about that, because it should just be an outpouring, as you say, a sort of cathartic way into exploring personal experience. And, and the least you think about it being read, the more likely you will touch on a sort of, a very sort of personal truth of your own. But again, yeah, I agree with you that this is what I advise my students, because I do a lot of teaching of memoir and I mentor people who are interested in writing memoir, that actually they should write that first draft like that. They should write the first draft for themselves before putting it out into the world or getting too self-conscious about it, because I think that can really hinder the process. And then, as you say, you can then return to it later and start sort of crafting it and thinking of it as more of an artwork work, more of something that you might then present as a story.
Yeah. And the other thing with memoirs and autobiographies as well is a lot of people would think, oh, I can't write about myself. Who's going to be interested in me? Autobiographies and memoirs are written by famous people that everybody wants to know about. There's nothing exciting about me. People think a lot of the time that they're quite normal and don't really have an interesting story to tell. But I think we all do in one way or another.
Well, we really do. And this is what I find so fascinating, is that actually, everyone has a story, of course. And often those stories are quite buried. They're buried in sort of family protection, and people don't tend to want to sort of spill the family secrets. But what I come across often with students who come to me is that if you have this kind of compulsion to write, which some of us do, it's almost like you're sort of born with this gift to actually start to sort of unearth some of this stuff and dig into it and ask questions of it, and it may not come out in writing, it might come out in art, or it may come out in therapeutic practice, or, or dance, even some kind of expressive art. But, some of us do have that need to sort of just stop and think, maybe we're those people who sort of stand on the periphery a little bit and kind of observe. But yeah, I think everybody has a story. In terms of publishing, I think publishers do look more for the extraordinary story. They want something that's out of the ordinary. But they are also looking at, sort of everyday experience, but dug into on a deeper level, because what I find also through writing is that the deeper you go into questions of yourself and humanity and why we are the way we are, the more universal it is, in that it sort of touches other people's lives. You come up with questions that are relevant to people more than yourself. So, I think you can write quite quiet and ordinary stories, but write them with a lot of depth and a lot of thought. And that can be a really beautiful book. I've got lots of memoirs on my shelves which do that.
Yeah, definitely. And you don't need to know who the author is in order to enjoy somebody's memoir at all, do you?
No, and in some ways it's better not that author isn't famous, because then, the sort of celebrity fame of it, of course it's fascinating, but it makes it's quite othering as well, isn't it? It's like, that person doesn't feel very real in a way.
Yeah. And when you're writing about family, that can be a tricky thing depending on what you want to say about your family, I guess. And I suppose that can put a lot of people off if they're writing something about some kind of childhood trauma or whatever. If the people involved are still alive, that can be a barrier, I guess.
Oh, a huge barrier. And again, this is probably the most common thing that I have coming to me is somebody who feels compelled to write their story because there's something has happened to them in their past, which, is pulling on their sleeve. It's tugging on their sleeve, and it won't leave them alone. And yet they are absolutely paralyzed by the fear of how if they put those words out there, it will be perceived by people that they love. And they don't want to hurt people that they love, because none of us do. And I used to say, when I was writing Sins of My Father, which was very much my perspective of my life with him, my relationship with him, and certain things that had happened to me as a child, because of him. And I felt that I had a right to that story. I feel less sort of sure of that now, I think, having had that book out in the world, that actually, I was not lucky that my father was not alive when it was published, obviously, but, I didn't have him there to contend with. But, that also brings up other complicated questions that, he wasn't there to defend himself. And I put this version of events out there that he couldn't contest because he wasn't alive. So that's sort of morally quite a problematic thing as well.
Yeah.
But I do believe that, all our stories merge with other people's. And so we do have to be responsible for that as writers.
And memory is a funny thing, isn't it? When you have a memory of something that's so clear in your mind, and you'd put money on it, the fact that it happened this particular way, and then you could discuss it with somebody else who was there, whether it's a relative or friend, and they have a completely different recollection to it all. And it's a very weird thing, that.
It is, because memory is often very emotionally driven, isn't it? And it's so particular to your own experience. And I think that we kind of mush up memories because, we sort of think, well, that definitely happened when I was 6 years old, but actually it could have been that you were 9 years old, or it could have been a combination of things that happened around that time. So yes, but I think memoir is very sort of, it declares itself as faulty. Its memory is faulty. It's very hard. It's very subjective. It's very hard to pin down. And so memoir, it sort of stands in that space between fiction and nonfiction, because, you can't really pin it down. And so it's very much driven by how you remember rather than the facts of what you remember.
Yeah. And a lot of people now are making much more of their memoirs, borrowing from biographies and fiction and even poetry and things, and kind of adapting the form, if you like.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that, again, makes it a very exciting form. It's quite hybrid. It's quite hard to pin down. I think it's something that publishers probably feel slightly kind of perplexed by, because it doesn't really fit into a category very well. Mm. But of course, that can also be really problematic because, there was the recent scandal with the Salt Path that was promoted as a memoir. But actually, when you look back at now what's been revealed about the premise of that book, that there were certain quite key factual points about Raina Wynn that didn't come into the writing of the book. You sort of question, well, actually, is it better as a piece of fiction? Should it have been promoted as fiction now with what we now know? So, yeah, it is problematic. But I think if you do write memoir, you are writing a form of nonfiction, and I think the most important thing about that is an honesty with your reader, so that you as the writer are honest and transparent, even when you don't know the truth. So even when you're dealing with nebulous memory, you can say that to your reader. You can say, I don't remember exactly what happened on this day in 1973, but this is what I imagine happened. So there are ways around that sort of slightly sticky part of it.
Yeah. And what a lot of people do, of course, is write fiction that's based on truth. If they've had a couple of really interesting things that happened to them in their life that they want to talk about, but it doesn't make up a book, then they'll use those stories and make up things and characters around it.
Yes, and you have a lot more freedom doing that, and also you have the protection of it being fiction. There is a natural disclaimer in fiction which will protect you legally as well. So I think that is perhaps a way that writers, I think particularly with first books, because I think you have to be quite bold to publish a memoir.
Yeah. And you talk about it being transformative. You say the radical craft of memoir and its power to transform. Are you talking about transforming the writer of the memoir or the reader of it?
I'm talking about both, really. It was certainly a transformative experience for me in that I was sort of haunted by my father and my relationship with him and the way he treated me and his betrayal of me and, certain parts of our past that I hadn't really processed, I suppose. And I think writing the book over the years it took me to write it. And I started writing Sins of My Father through a series of essays that I put out in the world and had published. And it sort of came out in various stages. I think the whole process of kind of revisiting the past in as much depth as I was able to, and that I was reading around my dad's cult, I was watching documentaries, I was asking questions of his sister about his childhood. He went to boarding school. I understood him in a very different way through that process. And so it definitely transformed my relationship to the experience that I had had as a child, in that I started to be able to stand apart from it and really understand it for what it was and not feel so affected by it. But I think through that process, if you're showing that process on the page in the book itself, that can be really transformative for the reader, because they then begin to see their own relationship with their parents in the same light. You know, if you've had similar experience, you know, you might have been raised at the same time or in the same, I was raised in London. You know, I had a lot of people write to me who had quite hippie parents, and, you know, there was a lot that resonated with them. So you realize actually that writing a memoir can be a really generous act, because you're kind of doing the work for them in a way, you know, and people then are like, oh God, I never really thought of it like that. And that was really, really helpful. So I found that side of it just so rewarding.
Yeah, I bet. And do you feel the writing of it gave you some kind of, I don't want to say closure necessarily, but that sort of feeling with regards to the relationship with your father?
Oh, completely. Yeah. I mean, absolutely 100%. It was a very strange thing when I held the book in my hands and was able to sort of put it on the shelf. You know, it became an object that I could actually move away from myself. It was almost like a sort of container that contained everything. And I've not looked back. Actually, it was an incredibly healing thing for me to do. Yeah.
So powerful.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think distance is important, and I had a lot of distance. You know, I did write it a good kind of, well, I started writing it probably 10 years after my father died, and so I think the distance really helped a lot.
It must make you realize how many people don't get that, you know, for people that do have some kind of trauma or issues with their parents or growing up and childhood and all this kind of stuff, which a lot of people do have in some way or another. For them to not go through their whole lives not expressing it, not going through any kind of therapy, not doing any journaling or diary, writing anything down, not producing a book or that kind of thing. How many people go through their whole lives holding on to that stuff and not having an outlet for it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was really lucky in that both my parents were writers, and my dad introduced me to journaling very young. I mean, you know, after he left when I was 6, I was really unhappy and, you know, didn't really understand why he'd abandoned us in such a kind of extreme way. He sort of disappeared to India and didn't come back for 6 months. And then shacked up with a much younger woman. And I found all that really, really difficult. And he passed me my first diary and he said, just write down your feelings. And I think that was the beginning of my relationship with writing and sort of understanding that actually you could overcome things through this simple act. So yeah, I was lucky in that way. But you're right, there are a lot of people who don't have that. And yeah, I mean, part of my teaching is always encouraging people to have some kind of journal or some way of reflecting on themselves.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing? With all the hurt and pain he caused you, he gave you the gift of writing, which has been your life.
Yes, well, he did. Absolutely. And, you know, but isn't that often the case? It's the people that we love that, you know, that often the people that we really love are, well, I should say it the other way around. Often the people who have the capacity to cause us pain are also people that we really love. And, you know, and he was a lovable person, but he was a very self-centered and damaged person. And that felt important to try and capture that in the book as well. It wasn't a victim narrative. It was me definitely trying to understand him as a human being. You know?
Well, it's been lovely to chat with you, Lily. Thank you so much for joining us. And if people want to get a copy of Into Being, The Radical Craft of Memoir and Its Power to Transform, it's available on our website, TRE.radio, and it's by Lily Dunn, who we've been chatting with. Lily, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.